Minecraft is one of the most powerful creative tools of the past decade. You can build quite literally anything you want. But if you've ever tried to build in Minecraft, you've probably learned pretty quick that it's harder than it looks. If your builds look like this, but you really want them to look like this, then you're in the right place. So the first step is your Minecraft settings. So the first thing you should be aware of is your mouse sensitivity. So I like to lower my mouse sensitivity because it actually forces you to focus more on the details. It's going to feel a little bit weird at first, but trust me, you're going to get used to it. If you're anything like me, your brain wants to put out a million ideas at once and it skips over the smaller details, so this is really a necessity. The second is your field of view. So your field of view should not be too wide or too narrow. I like to keep mine at around 85, and I'm working on a 27-inch monitor. If your monitor is smaller, like if you're working on a 13-inch laptop, you might be better off at about 100. The third thing is your fly speed, if you can control it. In single player, this might not be possible, but if you're on a multiplayer server, you can just use the /speed command. Okay, so let's move on to shape and size. So you're going to have to pick a scale for your build. I typically build in 1.5:1, where everything in the game is 50% bigger than in real life. So how you're going to do this is I take gray wool and I take green wool. And the gray wool here, it represents the open space in your floor. The green represents the ceiling and the floor above. And all you're going to do once you have this is you can stack it upwards. So you have a couple of different options. These are the ones that I typically use. So I sometimes use a 4-2 split. Sometimes I will use a 5-2 split. And other times you can use a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 open and then 3 split. So your open space has 5 blocks here. And then the upper parts here, you have a lower ceiling, you have an upper ceiling, and then you have a floor. So usually the only time you'd use this is if you're trying to make your ceiling a lot more detailed. And this way you can have a double layered ceiling, which makes it so that you can have molding on the bottom, and then you can put your actual lights up here. Another thing too with your scale is that on first floors you can typically go a little bit bigger than the normal ones. So if I was building a skyscraper and on the upper floors I wanted 4 open and then ceiling floor for a total of 6, maybe on the ground floor I would use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 open, so this would be 6 gray, and then I would have 2 green on top. Your build should have a distinct base, middle, and top section. So to distinguish between these sections, you should either have a material change, a facade design change, or a setback change. Okay, so for the actual proportions, I like to use the 2/3 rule, which means a minimum of 2/3 of the height of your tower is dedicated to the middle section of your tower. You should also try and match the context of the city. Don't try and stand out with your build, because a city is a system that works together. The tower base here is approximately the same height as the surrounding builds, which is represented by the cyan wool. You can also see over here that I use the 2/3 rule for this mid-rise here, and you can see that there's a distinct base, middle, and top section. Okay, so let's talk about the slenderness of towers. So slenderness is defined as the height to width ratio. So in this case, we have an example here. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. So this is 3 by 3, and it is 9 blocks tall. Okay, so you're going to take 9, you're going to divide it by 3, which gives you 3. So the slenderness ratio of this tower is 3:1. Okay, so what about this example? So it's 9 blocks tall, 1 wide, and 3 deep. So in structural engineering, for the sake of calculations, we take the smallest side. So it's 9 tall and 1 wide. So our slenderness ratio is going to be 9:1. Okay, so let's move on to a real-life example. So this here represents the slenderness ratio of 432 Park Avenue in New York City. So the slenderness ratio is 15:1. And here is the current most slender tower in the world, which is 111 West 57th Street in New York City. This has a slenderness ratio of 24:1. And these look unimaginably tall. And here's just a little model that I made the other day because I got bored. So a question you might be asking yourself is, how do these things actually stand up? Because they look impossibly tall. Well, good news for you is because I have the answer coming up in section 8. Okay, so let's talk about layouts. So this is the color scheme I'm going to use, and all the yellow is just for elevator shafts or stairs. Okay, so in any type of build, you should first decide what type of rooms you need and what type of rooms you want. And you should write this down somewhere because it's really going to help you. So I'm going to do two examples here. So this is the base of a bank tower, and this one here is the base of a residential tower. Okay, so for our planning example, we are going to make a list of the required rooms. So I want to have a lobby, I want to have an elevator waiting area, a mailroom, a vestibule, which is just an entryway with a keypad, and an entrance to the underground parking. For the optional items, I want to have a bike room, a party space, a reception desk, a coffee shop, and maybe a couple first floor shops if we have room. So a key point here is use real life references. There are so many free floor plans available, and if you just want to look at them just for reference, that is a great idea. Okay, so let's move back to our bank tower here. So what I did here on the first floor is that I have glass on all sides, and then you have two entrances here. Now, you will likely need another entrance here, which I forgot, so I'm just going to put that in right there, and then maybe we want another one back here. Okay, so right here, you have 4 elevators, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you have 2 staircases back here. So this is not up to code just yet. So if you wanted to have it up to code, you would have to pull this up here and do something like this, and then you could do something like this because it has to go all the way out to the side. Another option too is that you could just pull this staircase and pull it all the way over to the other side. So that's pretty much it for this. This one is pretty simple. If you did want to add some bathrooms or something, you could maybe add them back here, or if you wanted to, you could kind of stick them in a corner or something, but you just have to be careful of your window space. If you want me to make a video exclusively about layouts, then hit the like button to let me know, because if this video does well, then I know people like this type of content. Okay, so let's move on to building placement. So I want to talk about 2 different types of towers to start. Point towers are basically you have a base and then you have a tower that is on top, but it is set back a little bit. This just makes it so you have a little bit more light and it's a lot less intimidating for the people walking around on the street. Towers that are not point towers and just have a flat facade from the top to the very bottom are used more for when you are lacking space. This is a lot more common in New York City, although New York does have both. Okay, so let's jump into the city of India real quick. So this tower here is my very first tower in the city, and you can see that I used round corners. So all round corners do is just deflect the eyesight in this direction here. You can also see that it's on a corner here, so I wanted to kind of emphasize the corner by having one of the points on the corner. Now, this tower isn't necessarily a point tower, although it does have a base. It is only 1 floor, and then you can see it comes all the way down right here. So it is a bit of a blended tower. So one thing you can do if you are building in a city and you have a pretty big lot is that you can actually make multiple buildings. So I originally built this one and this one together, but I didn't want to use the whole thing for a tower. Otherwise, it would just create this giant ugly thing that's just kind of blocking views. The fun part about building in a city is that you can actually integrate it into other builds. So this here, you can see that the second floor of this tower actually connects through a sky bridge onto this one here too. So if you work with others when you are making your buildings, it's going to make your city a whole lot cooler. Okay, so let's look at another example here. So this is a condo building also in the city of India in Southern Marina, and you can see that it's kind of on a diagonal here. So what I wanted to do when I built this is I wanted to respect the water line and this path going along here. So you can see it fits the city rather than just sticking out like a sore thumb. This building is also staggered upwards, which just makes it a lot more interesting to look at and a lot less intimidating. I also didn't want to build it right on the water because I wanted to have a couple of community amenities like a bike rental shop and then some public washrooms here and an information stand. This just makes it so that the waterfront feels a lot more engaging to people visiting. Okay, so our next example is a brick tower that I originally built for Instagram and TikTok. If you want to see it and see the cool animation that I made with it, you can check it out using the links in the description. So originally, this building, including this space, came here and it went around back, and then this same facade design was just extended in the place of this building. One detail I want to point out is this area down here. So you can see that going from the sidewalk, you have to walk up here, so this is elevated by 2 blocks. This area here, you can't really have full windows otherwise. If you're standing inside and looking this way, this is going to be your view. So what I decided to do, instead of just having a blank wall, I decided to extend the columns down, and then in place of where the windows would be, I just used brick walls instead. So even though if you were building this tower, this space is technically not yours and somebody else may have built it, it just respects the other space and makes the space more interesting. Okay, so our last example is this car dealership. So this is really interesting because we have a rail line that follows up and around this curve here. And then you see the building, it's down here on the first floor, but on the second floor, it's actually pushed back in there. So it respects the actual context of the city. You can also see the same thing happening on the front here. You can see the road, it's a bit diagonal here. And then the facade, it also matches that diagonal. This is a realistic way to design because in real life big cities, property values are so expensive that you want to use every single inch of space that you have. So the key takeaway here is build quality over quantity, and don't try and build to be the center of attention. Build your buildings to enhance the space around it. Okay, so let's talk about facades. So for these examples, I'm going to be using CubePack, which you can check out using the link in the description, which is available for Java. So here's the color palette that I'm going to use and all the materials that are involved. Okay, so for these examples, I am going to use 1, 2, 3, 4 open, 1 block for the ceiling, and 1 block for the floor. All right, let's talk about depth. So you want to avoid having too little depth. So this just means that there is nothing here, so it's all just a flat facade. Another thing you want to avoid is having too much. This here is 1.5, so you have your full block, you have another half block here, and then you have your glass panes here. So this, personally, I believe to be a little too much. I personally believe that the best way is to have a balanced facade. So this example here uses half a block. So you have your full block and you have your glass pane. As you can see here, you can also use walls and glass panes here, which just gives you a little bit more fine control over it. Okay, so that's a good start with depth. So how do we actually build it? So here's a couple examples of how to decorate your facade. So something that I like to use, if we are using glass all the way up and no breaks in between, I will usually put a different type of glass either on the floor level or on the ceiling level. So in CubePack, I'm using glass, and then this here is lime stained glass. So with Optifine, with normal glass, it all connects, but then your lime stained glass does not, which makes it so that you can make some pretty cool designs in CubePack. Again, you don't have to use CubePack to make cool designs, but it just makes it a little bit easier for you. Okay, so you have your bottom here. This one's a little bit flat. This one's a little bit more balanced, but you know, it's still a little bit bland. Okay, so this is all well and good, but what if you want a little bit more detail? So let's come over here. So you need world edit for this, but if you have world edit, then you can extend the glass on 1, 2, and 3 sides, so that this here, you have a line that draws your eye upwards. So if you have world edits, then you can use this command here, and then you can change the west, east, north, or south if you need to. So this here, this is just indicating the direction that this way is north. Okay, so this isn't a bad design, but if you're repeating it up all the way on your tower and side to side, it might get a little bit repetitive. So this is where stuff like this comes into play. So you have the same thing, but instead of having them on each one going across here, you might have one on the side here and one on the side here. You could also just do one in the middle if you really wanted to, and then delete these two. So this here is a brown stained glass pane, but you don't have to go with this. This is just in CubePack. This one is also in CubePack. This is an acacia fence. But if you're in default, and say for example you are working with a white color theme, then you might want to go with something like a white stained glass pane, and you can just replace them going up the side, just like this. You can also use end rods, and the thing about end rods is that if you're going for a dark color theme in CubePack, or if you're going for more of a lighter color theme in default, then these emits light, so then going up your tower, especially at night, it's going to look really, really cool. Okay, so now let's take this design, put it over here, and then we're going to stack it. A common mistake that I want to point out to you is being able to see your floor and your ceiling right through your windows. One way to avoid this, you actually take either the material that you're using for the vertical part or a similar material, whether it be lighter or a little bit darker, and then you just cover the first layer here instead. So if we compare it, you have this layer of flooring normally, and then you have this one here going across this side. And these walls here, this is just another detail I like to use. If you think it's a little bit weird looking like this, you can add walls that go up the side here just to give it a little bit more depth coming around the side. Okay, so now that we have one side, we're gonna take it and then we're gonna stack it upwards because it can look a lot different once you actually have it in place. When you're building towers, you should be aware of what your design is actually doing to the people that are looking at it. So if you're standing down here, usually your eyes would be going upwards, right? Because you have this column here and you have these things sticking out on the side. If, for example, you were to take this and you had this here going across, and then you stacked this all the way along. I know this is just an example and it looks really bad, but if you had this on each one of these, then your eyes would be likely drawn side to side rather than up and down. So something you might notice as an observer, if you're standing at the base of a tower, and let's pretend this is 50 floors tall for a minute, and the facade is identical all the way up, you're gonna have a really hard time at telling how tall the tower actually is. The thing about people is that they like to know things. The thing that makes architecture interesting to look at is when you can recognize patterns or understand the building. So this is what we're gonna do here. We are going to introduce breaks. So this one here, this is a double floor of the identical glass, and then you're gonna just take out the glass here. So if you took this and stacked it upwards a bunch, you're going to be able to tell roughly how tall it is because they're in 2-block increments. You can also do the same thing here where you take 3 and say you stacked this upwards a whole bunch and you had 4 different distinct sections of this and each of them were 3 tall. You could immediately tell that it was 12 floors tall. Breaks are used all the time in buildings, whether it be skyscrapers or small details like this. So this is what we're going to talk about next. Whenever you have a transition of materials, you need a break. So this here, it does not look good. You have, say, for example, a first floor and a second floor. Okay, so let's get rid of this awkward transition. So the first way you can do this is by using a setback. So all you do is you go up, you go back 1 or 2 blocks, and then you keep going upwards. I would also highly recommend just having 1 or 2 blocks, or maybe even a trap door in this case, signaling that this is the top of this section. Okay, so our next option here is a cantilever. So this just means that there's an overhang. So again, instead of just having this weird transition between 1 block to the next one, you're going to go up, and then it's going to be a 1 block difference, and then you're going to keep going up. You can use more than 1 block if you'd like, but try and keep it as small as you can. Okay, our last option here is an actual break. So you go up to the top of this section here, you have an indent, it goes up, and then it comes back out. Okay, so let's talk about some important design elements. The thing about your designs is that people like to know things. They want to know about your building. They want to know how it works. So there's different ways you can do this. You can draw the eye upwards, and then you can introduce different breaks to show them how tall it is. So let's start with the first example. So this one here, it only has these elements that go upwards, and it's really hard to tell how tall this building actually is if you are standing on the ground right here. If we take this building, we copy it, and then we just delete these 2 floors here, it gives us a bit of an indication of how tall it is. So this would be considered the base, and then this would be considered the upper floors. You may have also noticed that this tower follows the 2/3 rule. So from here down is 7 floors, and then the rest of the 21 floors are made for the actual tower portion itself. So if we move on to example 3 here, you can see that the eyes are immediately drawn side to side rather than upwards. If this is the goal that you're going for, then go for it. Otherwise, I would recommend sticking to vertical elements. If you want to give people a little bit more context as to how tall your tower is, just like the example that we were talking about back here, you can use different sections here. So you can have 1, 2, 3 of a facade design. You can take a break, 1, 2, 3, a break, and then you can keep going upwards. If your building and facade don't necessarily agree with the height, then you can make your top section a little bit taller. So this one here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whereas the rest of them are 3. For our 5th example, we're going to look at a point tower. So this one here has the same effect as number 2 here, except it's just adding a base rather than just a cut right there between floors 6 and 7. So all this does is that it gives you a little bit more daylight when it comes down here, because when you're standing on the street, if you have towers going all the way up, it is going to block quite a bit of daylight and it's going to be a lot darker. If you really want to show somebody that you know what you're doing when you're designing a tower, you can do something like this by introducing setbacks as you go up. You'll probably notice that the tallest skyscrapers in the world do this anyway. That's because that the load has to be transferred down through the tower, and if you have more of a heavy load on top, it just makes the systems more structurally inefficient. So if I fly up here, I'm going to stop right here and I'm going to put a couple lines on the screen. So you can see that there's 3 lines and that as you go up, they become more and more vertical. This is a very subtle design trick that makes it so that people will look towards the top of the tower. There is no one solution for building towers because every situation is unique. You just want to choose the one that fits the context of your city the best. Okay, so we have these design solutions, but what about shells and complex patterns? Well, let's look at some examples. This is a tower that I'm working on for another video, and you might think it looks complicated, but it's a lot easier to build than you think. All you have to do to build complex facades like this is start with a base. So if we go into the middle here, we can see that the inside is just a perfect rectangle. There's nothing special about it. You have your stairwells, you have your elevators, and you have more elevators here, and then if you want, you could add washrooms around here, but you can see that it's all on a grid. Same thing here. So you have your columns, and then over here you have your exterior columns, and then you have your curtain walls. So if you look very closely, you can see that this here is actually the exterior wall, and then this is just an extension. So I made this cool design, and I stacked it up and down, and then I made all these cool angles here. Okay, so if we jump back into the city of Andia here, let's check out this tower that my friend made. So all they did for the actual tower portion is they made one floor, they made two floors, and then they stacked it downwards. Because you have this white element, then you have a break, and then you have it again. So this floor and this floor are identical. Well, actually they are two floors. So you see he used a double, just like we were talking about earlier. And one last example here before we move on is this building here. So all they did is they made these cool hexagons, except they're elongated. I'm not actually sure what this shape is called, but you can see that they used rails here in CubePack, and they made this floor and this floor, the exterior facade, identical, and then offset it a little bit inwards for this one and this one. And all they did is they just stacked it upwards. Let's talk about windows and doors. So for these examples, I'm going to use this to represent a window, I'm going to use this to represent a door, and then this black here is going to be a wall. Okay, so let's first look at what not to do. So the thing that's wrong with this is that this door is way too short, right? If you're building at a bigger scale, you're going to want your doors to match. So this is just way too small. Okay, so if we move on to the next one, let's raise the door height a little bit. But now it looks a little bit weird, right? You have your door that's 1 block wide and 4 blocks tall. So the ratio is a little bit off, so your door is a little bit too narrow. If we move on to this one, we can see that our door is now the same size as our windows, which is now 2 by 4. And it just matches a lot better too, because you can see that you have a column, you have a gap of 2, column, gap of 2, column, gap of 2, and then another column. But here's something to consider. What if you don't want your door to go all the way up? So this is what this next example is. So all you're going to do is you're going to have your same size windows on this side and this side, and then this opening is still going to be the same size as your window openings, except on the top here you can replace this with a window, and then your door is now 2 blocks wide and 3 blocks deep. So let's look at an example. Okay, so we're back in the city of Andia, and we are going to check out this brick tower once again. So I used this trick down here, so you have your window of this size, and then the opening for the door. The opening here is 5 blocks across and 6 down, which is identical to this one here. And this also makes it so that it's easier to translate upwards, so that you don't have to create an entirely new design for this side. So you can see that I used this design trick with this front entrance. So I didn't want to go all the way up here because then it would be 5 blocks tall and then 1.5 blocks wide. And I felt that was a little bit too narrow. So to make it look a little bit better, I decided to extend this down by 1 and then just have the door like this. And as I just mentioned, you can see a representation here, but when you have the opening for your door, even if it isn't the entire door, if you want to use glass here, if these openings are all the same size, which is 2 by 4 in this case, if you stack it upwards, your windows and the top section of your building is going to be a lot easier to make. The last thing I want to talk about related to doors is the depth. So if you have a balanced approach like this, so you have it too deep, that means that you can have a facade here, and then if you really want to, you can either have a detailed facade on the outside where you can add some depth, or you can make it so that on the inside here, you can have a different material. No, I would not recommend using grass. We will talk about color in the next section. So if we look at the second one here, this one is a 2 by 4 door, but it is 3 deep. So this one here, I don't really like it because it feels a little bit like a tunnel. So our last example here is the most common, where you just have it as 1 wide. Now this doesn't really give you the flexibility to have any more depth in your facade, but if you can make it work, I would recommend using it. Alright, let's talk about colors. Colors are very important, and it can make or break your build. So just some basics about colors. You have your primary colors, which are red, yellow, and blue. And then if you combine these colors, you can get your secondary colors of orange, purple, and green. If I want my build to feel a little bit bigger than it actually is, I'm going to use light colors. But on the other side, if you want it to feel a little bit smaller and more compact, then you can use darker colors. If you're trying to choose an accent color, you should choose it based on whether you want your build to feel warmer or cooler. Now, there are quite a few design tips that you can include in interiors, but I'm going to save that for another video. Alright, so let's actually talk about some color palettes. So this here, if you are using dark colors, you might want to use some dark glass to go with it. You can also combine in some regular glass if you would like to add a little bit of depth. Again, you can use your grays, gray stained glass, and regular glass. If you want to go with something a little bit lighter, then you can go with your light grays, or you could just go with whites. If grayscale isn't really your style, you can go with some gradients here. So this here is an orange gradient. So you have your red sand, which is a little bit darker. You have an intermediate, which is your smooth red sandstone. And then up top is your polished granite. Now you can use this for any color as long as you have a dark, a middle, and then a little bit of a lighter color, just to add some contrast. Now you can tighten them up a little bit. If you want this not to be as light, then you can choose something that more closely matches this one here or one down here. This next one here is one of my favorite combos, which is red brick. You have any sort of black material, and then you have glass here too. If you are new to the world of color palettes, then I would recommend choosing one of these four here, and then you combine it with one of the colors. If you want to go for something super modern looking and clean, you can use a white block and then just some glass. I also like to use some dark color schemes where I use black blocks, black glass, and then regular glass too. Okay, let's talk about this one. I really don't like this because all you're doing here is you're taking a really dark color, you're mixing a really light one, and then you also have this blue in here too. And I just think it doesn't really work well. If you were to change this white wool to something like this, then I think that works a little bit better. Or if you wanted just to have this, then I also think that works better. But if you have really heavy contrasting colors, it tends to clash quite a bit. The last one we're going to look at is this. So this is interesting because it isn't really a color combination that you see often. But the question is, does it work? It looks really interesting, and I actually kind of like it. So there is a reason for this, but I want to see if you guys can figure it out in the comments. Okay, last but certainly not least, let's talk about the structural realism of your builds. Let's jump to this area where I keep all my secret buildings. So you can see that there's this concrete part that goes around here. You have a staircase here, you have a couple elevators, and then you have another staircase here. This is meant to represent the top of a tower that's currently under construction, and for those of you that are familiar with construction, yes, these are supposed to be higher, but this is just a demonstration. So this concrete wall that goes all the way up the tower is called a shear wall. So a skyscraper that uses a shear wall can be represented as a tree. So the shear wall represents the trunk, all of the floors that extend outwards are the branches, and all the glass on the outside are like the leaves. When we look at this, you can see that all of these columns are aligned as well, which means that it is on a structural grid. By having a structural grid and placing columns in the intersection of the grid, it makes it a lot easier for the structural engineers to calculate loads. Okay, so if we jump to the top of the finished build here, we can see that there are these little fan things here. So all of this stuff on the roof, this is called your HVAC equipment. HVAC just stands for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Usually HVAC systems are pretty complicated, so you can get away with just kind of scattering it over your rooftop. You can also see these staircases here that I brought all the way up because this is how you actually get to the roof. Usually by the time you get here, this will be a locked door that you can't actually get through unless you have a key. This right here is your elevator overrun, and although it doesn't actually stick out like this in real life, I decided to add some extra details just to give it a little bit more complexity. Also, if you look at these things here, these are not structural, but they are a little detail that you can add to your tower. So what these are is that they pick up the window washing device and then they lower the workers down the side of the building safely so that they can wash the windows. You might still be wondering from earlier in the video of how those super tall towers stand up. So the first answer to that is they use a shear wall, but some of them are so unimaginably tall that they have to use this thing called a tuned mass damper. A tuned mass damper is a ball that is suspended in the top of a tower that is typically filled with water or concrete to increase the inertia at the top of the tower to reduce swaying. I'm in my 5th year of an architectural engineering undergrad program, and I do a lot of structural engineering in my university classes. If you want to see me build a Minecraft skyscraper using real structural engineering techniques, let me know by pressing like on this video, and you could even consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.